So the question this morning is, doesn't Christianity cause violence and oppression? And so hopefully it's helpful. As I was writing my sermon, there were so many different ways it felt like it felt like I could go, and so many different things to talk about. It was really hard to cover everything, and so hopefully we'll cover a couple of things here, and I'd love to know what sort of questions you guys have also. Just out of curiosity, we're probably like a month and a half into this series. Sort of the questions that we've addressed so far, are there any that you feel like are probably the most common, or the ones that you have heard sort of asked the most as you talk to people about Christianity?
Personally, I think the themes that I've heard you address, I really can't say that I've heard any particular one more often than another. I think the one that Doug did was perhaps one of the hardest ones to address, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, anybody could pick one of these themes and say this is really tough to deal with.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think suffering is one of those things, because it's so personal too, that it's it makes it really hard to wrestle with. No, he did a good job. Well, there are a couple different categories I was thinking we'd cover, and then kind of ask some questions here as we go. The first, I just thought we'd start with the idea of human dignity again. We talked about it some in the sermon this morning, but I do think it's one of those things that gives biblical faith a real advantage in talking about some of these issues. For what we talked about today with violence and oppression, and even some of the categories we'll talk about over the next couple of weeks too. When we talk about how the Bible deals with women, when we talk about diversity and that sort of thing, some of these things come back again and again to this idea of human dignity, and the reason that these that these other issues are important, and why Christians address them is because we believe everybody has inherent value and worth because they're made in the image of God, and so it really is helpful. There's I was going to read from a book here. There were a couple of books that were helpful. This book, Atheist, Overreach, I think maybe I've mentioned it one other time. It's a really good book on a number of things, but it has a whole chapter on human dignity, and sort of where we get the idea of universal human rights from, and so he does a really good job of addressing how the Christian faith gives us the best tools to be able to do that. And then there's another book, and I'm going to read from it a little bit. It's called The Rise of Christianity by Rodney Stark. And if you're interested in sort of the early church and what made the early church so successful, I guess, it's a really good book to talk about. How could such a small sort of insignificant religion in a lot of ways, right? Jesus comes and he has these 12 disciples and some followers besides that, and they're really insignificant in terms of the layout of the Greco-Roman world that he lived in. How does it go so quickly from that to to this really influential religion that that even the emperor of Rome, Constantine, wants to take on because of because of the impact that it's having. And so he does a really good job of talking about all of these different things that worked in play to make Christianity sort of I guess rise so quickly. And one of the things he talks about is how terrible life was in cities in that day, right? Just how much you had to deal with to survive in cities in that day, in terms of health challenges, in terms of crime, in terms of sicknesses and disease and natural disasters, and all of these things made life really difficult and really challenging. And he talks about how the church, because of its ability to see the dignity in every person, creates this community of people that is so compelling to the people who were living then, that it begins to draw them in, and it totally baffles the sort of the religious and political leaders of the day, because it's such a small sort of sect, and then people are just drawn to it. There's one line where he says, the pagan religions of the day really struggled to get their followers to do anything. It was like people followed the religion, and they sort of did what they had to have social standing, but they didn't really do anything in terms of working for the good of people around them. And then he talks about Christianity, and this is what he says. He says, Christianity revitalized life in Greco-Roman cities by providing new norms and new kinds of social relationships, able to cope with many urgent urban problems. To cities filled with the homeless and impoverished, Christianity offered charity as well as hope. To cities filled with newcomers and strangers, Christianity offered an immediate basis for attachments. To cities filled with orphans and widows, Christianity provided a new and expanded sense of family. To cities torn by violent ethnic strife, Christianity offered a new basis for social solidarity. And to cities faced with epidemics, fires, and earthquakes, Christianity offered effective nursing services. And so he talks about all of these ways in which the Christian faith actually infused life into people of that time. You read in other places where where at that time people would just abandon unwanted babies out. They'd leave them out to be exposed to the elements and to die. Women and children had so little clout to sort of do anything or to have any value in that society. And then you have Christianity coming in, and the church is rescuing these babies and raising them as their own. They're serving the poor. They're they're nursing people who are dying because of plagues, when everyone else has sort of abandoned the city in these times. And you see this dynamic of, far from Christianity being something that is sort of promoting the violent and oppressive nature of that culture, it actually transformed it into something that was that loved and valued people from all different places and all different things, not just the rich and the powerful. And so it's really a testament to the church. It's really a testament to the power of the gospel that the church was able to change things so dramatically in such a short period of time. And I think that's something that people miss today also, is that the standard that Christianity is often measured against, in terms of how it treats people, and what it does for the culture around it. A, a lot of these things, like human dignity, like the fact that violence towards and oppression towards the weak and the poor and the marginalized, that's sort of assumed these days that, oh, well, yeah, those things are wrong, obviously. How is the church doing in sort of not doing those things? But those things weren't actually values in the broader culture until the church came along and infused these values into the culture. Right, the Greco-Roman world did not value every life equally. It did not promote the dignity of every person by a long stretch, and yet the church changed that, and now it's just an assumption that those things are important. But Christianity is actually the thing that has made them valuable, made them important, and given us a reason to be able to say that we should care about these things and that we should pursue these things and promote these things. And so, so like I said, the early church is really a great testament to the power of the gospel in this area. When we think about sort of violence towards other people, we I mentioned a number of the places, a number of the things that that people sort of point to, right? You often hear people say, well, what about the Crusades, right? If the church is so good, what about all the violence that you had there, and and some of these other things, and so like I said this morning, I think when we're sort of responding to these questions, or maybe pushback from other people. One, like I said this morning, I don't think we can deny that that those things exist, right? I don't think it's helpful to sort of deny or justify the terrible things that have been done in the name of the church, right? Now, but I also think it's helpful to acknowledge.
Kelly, you still got Stephen?
Whoops.
Here he comes.
Oh, there we go.
All right.
All right, I'm back. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. Took a break for a second there. There we go. And so anyhow, I think when we're talking to people about this, it's important to it's only fair to say we see violence being perpetrated by all sorts of ideologies, right, and all sorts of religious people and non-religious people, and I think that's I think it's more an illustration of human nature, right, than anything else. And so I think it's a good place to start. One of the challenges I think people have is that people look at people outside of faith, maybe look at people of faith in Jesus and say, well, you are just hypocrites, right? Like that's because there are times where this has been where Christians have terrible mistakes in their life, right? They've done things that don't match up with what they say they believe. And some of that, I think, is a misunderstanding of what Christianity is about, right? I think some people from the outside of Christianity would look at it and say, well, Christianity is a way to make sort of bad people good people, right? And so if you say that you're a Christian, what you're saying is that you are a really good person, right? Maybe you even think you're a better person than people who aren't Christians. That's why you're that's why you're a Christian. And and I think people even have the perspective that once you're a Christian, what you're saying is that you're not going to make any mistakes again, right? That you're just going to be sort of this good person from now on, and that's what it means to have faith. And so sometimes I think in that discussion, it's helpful to help people understand what's at the heart of the gospel, right? Not that not that believing in Jesus makes us perfect people or makes us think that we're better than anybody else. It actually humbles us because it causes us to acknowledge that we're not better than anybody else, right? That we recognize our own sinfulness and our own brokenness as much as anybody, and that's why we need Jesus, because the Christian life is a life of repentance, right? That being a part of the church is where sick people go to get healthy and to encourage each other. And so sometimes I think the pushback can be a misunderstanding of what the gospel actually is, and I think that's a helpful it's a helpful opportunity to talk about that with people. One of the things that I mentioned this morning, and that I think is one of the big parts of this question is the places in the Bible where God is sort of the author of violence, in a sense, right? That he prescribes violence to for his people or in different things. Are there any stories that you can think of from the Bible that stick out to you as like, this is a really hard story or a really hard passage to sort of reconcile, right? When we're thinking about what God does and how do we understand the fact that God did this or said this?
Well, the flood in Sodom and Gomorrah can qualify.
Yeah.
There. I think they illustrate, though, that we have lost a sense of just how devastating and destructive and wicked sin is.
Yeah.
That we have looked at. There's been a trend in our times that's been developing for some time about the goodness of humanity, and it's there. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
But in that we have lost how evil people can be, and I'm convinced the flood was a response to an evil that we cannot comprehend anymore.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And the same with Sodom and Gomorrah. That the positive trend is looked and said, well, that big, bad, mean old God just crushed those human beings, those good human beings.
Right.
No.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think it was R.C. Sproul who said, when people ask why do bad things happen to good people, the first thing he says is, well, there are no good people, right?
Yeah.
And so and there's a certain point he's trying to make with that, right? But I think it's the point you're making, is that our tendency is to look back at that and just look at what God did and not understand the circumstances, right? And how it fits into the broader story of history and of the Bible. Yeah, no, those are good, and I think you're right. There are a number of those places in Scripture where God destroys, wipes out a people or a place like that, and often it's in response to evil, right? It's in judgment of on evil, And you know, and I think that goes back even to the question last week that Pastor Nathan talked about with, you know, how can a good God send people to hell, right? But if God is a judge among other things, right, then he is perfectly within his rights to judge sin and to judge evil, and so we get glimpses of that throughout Scripture. You know, and another way to look at it, you know, another perspective would even be to say it's sort of incredible we don't see more of it, right, in Scripture, when you see how often people fail, when you see sort of the ugliness of what you know, of what people are capable of. You know, it's almost surprising we don't see God just wiping people out all the all the time, which you know, and I think that and I think, you know, and I think that connects back to, you know, we talked about this morning a little bit, where what one of the things that gives us the ability to not to not repay evil for evil, right? To not respond to our enemies with violence is this confidence we have that God will judge evil, right? That he will judge the wrongs that have been done to us. And so it's not our job to exact justice, because it's God's job, and he will do it. And so that frees us from feeling like we have to do it ourselves. And you know, and the good news in that is what we often see in the world around us is when people, for example, when people rise up out of oppression, okay, and sort of you know, come to a place where they're able to rise and get rid of the oppressors, right? Somehow, through some sort of revolution, through some sort of whatever. Most of the time, those people who were oppressed and have now risen up find a way to then become the oppressors again, and it's this cycle that continues, you know, that continues to turn as revolution really only just brings a rise to new oppressors. And what, you know, we saw like in Romans 12, and what we see with God being a righteous judge and a just judge, is that we can leave judgment to him, so that we don't just become another oppressor in our attempts to judge, you know, to bring justice upon other people. We can trust that God will do that on our behalf.
And I always figure he does a better job of it anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, you know, I think about that sometimes, even with even with like my kids, you know, and I think about the discipline I give to my kids sometimes, where after the fact I look back and I can think, I don't know that I was completely fair in that, or I don't know that I judged the situation completely correctly, and you know, and you get that sense even, you know, even yourself sometimes. And so so yeah, you're right. God is much better at it than we are. Yeah, one of the other places I tend to think about with this is kind of the whole book of Judges, right? The book of Judges seems to be one terrible story after the other, in terms of really just some incredibly graphic violence, right? Some terrible violence in terms of murder and sexual violence, and all of these different things that sort of come up all the way through the book. And and I think one of the things that, if we step back for a minute and look at the book of Judges and then how the book of Judges fits into all of Scripture, I think one of the reasons it's written the way it is because we're supposed to be horrified by it, right? We're supposed to be shocked by what we see there, because the refrain over and over again in the book of Judges is that everyone did what was right in their own eyes, right? And so we hear over and over again, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And then we have an illustration of what that leads to, right? When everyone does what's right in their own eyes, it leads to sort of this breakdown in society and in culture and in people's lives. It leads to violence. It leads to oppression. It leads to all of these things that we see in that book. And so I think in one sense we're supposed to be horrified by it, because God wants us to see how, even as he delivered the Israelites and brought them into the promised land, the Israelites still weren't able to keep their end of the bargain, right? That they were their side of the covenant. They're unfaithful again and again. So yeah, and then and so I think that's where you have to look at a lot of these stories on a case-by-case basis to be able to say, what is it that God is doing in this specific instance? Because if you look at sort of the pattern of Scripture, it's not one of God continually of God's continual sort of violence in these moments. There's specific reasons why he brings about these things that he does. And even in like the book of Judges, for example, one of the reasons God specifically tells the Israelites, you're to destroy the Canaanites as you come into the promised land, right? In Joshua, you're supposed to completely wipe them out and wipe out evidence of them. It's a picture of of God's response to sin, like we were saying. But I also think it's God knowing the Israelites and knowing that if they don't root out evil completely from their midst, it's they're going to sort of succumb to it, and they're gonna and eventually, given the choice between choosing God or choosing these other gods and these other idols in their midst, they're gonna stray from God. And what happens? The Israelites don't listen, right? They don't destroy people completely like God said they were supposed to. And the very thing God was trying to prevent from happening for his people happens, right? And the Israelites intermix with the Canaanites. They become unfaithful, and it leads to this to the story in Judges where everyone's doing what's right in their own eyes. And so we see both God's judgment of sin, God's judgment of evil, and his sovereignty, right? To know what's best through these different stories. The last thing that I was going to mention was just that the thing that we always can come back to in understanding a topic like this is the cross, right? If we if we're asking the question, doesn't Christianity cause violence and oppression? The cross gives us a way to say, God isn't God isn't promoting this for his people. God actually comes and takes violence and oppression on himself, so that he can heal the world of it, and so that he can ultimately one day return and rid the world of it. And so, when we look at what it is Jesus took on himself, we see that he experienced evil and violence on himself, and he took those things on willingly on our behalf, so that his people uh, would have new life in him, right? An ability to have a different life than that in him, and that ultimately, when he returns, that the new heavens and the new earth are going to be marked by no violence, no oppression, because of the redemption that he brings to the world. I was going to read just from Isaiah 53 a little bit, because I think it's a helpful picture for us as we as the accusation is leveled against God that he promotes violence, or that he causes violence on other people, to see that really the greatest violence that is perpetrated he does on his own son for us, and for our salvation. Isaiah 53 says, "For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and as one from whom men hide their faces. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shears is silent, so he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people? And they made his grave with the wicked, and with a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors." And so, and so even more than God promoting or causing violence, God turns his wrath on his son, right? And Jesus takes on this, like it says, this oppression, this violence that he didn't deserve, and he takes it on himself, so that we can be reconciled to God, so that our evil, the violence and oppression that comes out of us could be atoned for, and so this is the hope that the gospel gives us in the midst of conversations around these topics, is that not only does God not cause these things, not only is he not aloof to these things, but God God understands them, right? That Jesus came and took these things on himself so that he could sympathize with us, and so that he could atone for them, to make us right with God. And so this sort of redemption, this sort of hope in the midst of a world where we see violence and oppression all around us, right? This is the good news, right? This is why it's good news, is that Jesus has come to give us another way, and so we see the faithfulness of God even through Jesus, to give us hope in the midst of hopelessness in these areas. So, do you guys have any other questions from the sermon this morning, or sort of along this topic?
I don't have a question, but I've got an observation that's related to what you were just talking about. I had a counseling colleague who was an atheist in Britain, and he rejected God in part because he saw the cross event as divine child abuse, that God sent his son into the world to beat up on him, and did beat up on him. So it got me thinking about, how can I talk about that? How were we conveying, how was it grasped that some people were seeing this as divine child abuse? Because he surely wasn't thinking that by himself. There had to be others that were thinking the same way. So I started talking about it. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. The world took him and beat the tar out of it. I mean, the descriptions of the event are horrendous.
Right.
What we know about, I mean, we don't have people that witness it, but we have some medical descriptions of what could happen on the cross. And before we got to the cross, it was brutal beyond comprehension. God could have taken that event. I mean, I mentioned the flood in Sodom and Gomorrah. He responded for far less, wiped out a community and the world for far less than, this was his son that got beat up on like that. He could have rained down fire and brimstone and destroyed everything, but instead offered forgiveness for everybody's sin. That, the only condition is whether you accept the forgiveness or not. But that atheist helped me articulate it a little differently for me, because I now, as I tried to tell people who don't believe, they don't get it any better when I present it like that than when you talk about the cross anyway. Resistance is resistance. And that they're picking on us and saying how mean the church has been, fostering violence and what have you. I agree with you. We got to own up to it. It happened. It's awful, terrible, but it doesn't represent what Christ is about, which you brought out again and again. It's not what Christianity is about. So we can't be in denial. But whenever we make an adjustment, Satan and company make a counter adjustment, and we just got to keep presenting the gospel the best we can. And the cross is still a key to this.
That's interesting to have a conversation about that.
Unfortunately, he died, and I don't know if he ever became a Christian or not. It was not too long after we had that conversation. So, one day I'll find out, but not during this life.
It's interesting how having conversations with people who don't believe in Jesus can help us articulate better what we do believe, and be able to think through it for ourselves. It's really, it's a challenge for ourselves. And so I think, I think that's an important part of of us sharing our faith, right? And talk and building relationships with people that don't know Jesus, is that we want them to know, like you're saying, we want the chance to be able to share with them, but it can also really sort of ground and anchor our faith too, as we work through some of those issues and some of those things. I have those experiences with students a lot too, where they ask really good questions, and it's and so to have to really think through, all right, how do I answer this, or how do I explain this in a way that that makes sense and doesn't just use sort of the phrases I always use because I'm in the church and around church people a lot. But how do I articulate this in a way that's that makes sense? And so well, that's interesting. Thanks for sharing that. Any other thoughts before we go? I realized I forgot to mention just a couple of other books in the beginning. Making Sense of God has a chapter called how does he word it here? A justice that does not create new oppressors, and we talked about that a little bit tonight. But it was a really helpful chapter to kind of think about. And then this Confronting Christianity book that we've been looking at a number of times has a chapter on this question as well, which is pretty helpful. That I'd recommend besides those couple of other ones. So all right, well, thank you guys for joining us, and hope you guys have a good rest of the evening.
All right, you too.
All right, thanks, guys.
All right, good evening, Kelly.
Hey, Bud.